The Americans, with a mix of grim humor and resignation, christened it the Iron Cathedral. The British, staring up at its absurd silhouette, labeled it the Three-Storey Disaster. The Soviets, who received them through Lend-Lease, were far darker in their assessment, calling it a coffin for 7 brothers. The Germans simply laughed, tagging it a splendid target for their gunners. In the harsh light of 1941, the M3 medium tank was arguably the most mocked armored vehicle on the face of the earth. Standing a staggering 10 feet tall, with a cannon protruding from the side of its hull, like a naval warship from 1918, it looked like a fossil. It was a machine that seemed to belong to the muddy trenches of the previous war, not the mobile blitzkrieg of the modern era. Every army that received one found new, creative ways to insult it. But in May 1942, this rolling joke did something that no British tank had been able to do in 2 years of bloody conflict. It stopped Erwin Rommel's Panzers cold. To understand why this ugly machine mattered, we must look back to June 1940. The world watched in horror as German armor conquered France in just 6 weeks. The panzer divisions that shattered the French army and drove the British into the sea at Dunkirk were not superior in numbers. In fact, the French possessed more tanks, and often better armored ones. But the German advantage lay in doctrine. German crews were better trained, their radios allowed for fluid coordination, and their commanders understood a revolutionary concept: how to concentrate armor at decisive points to punch through enemy lines. American military planners watched the newsreels in darkened rooms in Washington, terrified by what they were seeing. The paradigm of modern warfare had shifted overnight. Tanks were no longer slow support weapons designed to walk alongside infantry. Tanks were now the decisive arm of combat, the predators of the battlefield. The United States Army, at that moment, possessed roughly 400 tanks. Most were M2 light tanks armed only with machine guns. A few newer models carried small 37mm cannons, barely large enough to scratch the paint of a modern Panzer. If America entered the war, its soldiers would face the most experienced, ruthless armored force in history, with equipment designed for a generation of warfare that no longer existed. The Army knew exactly what it needed to survive. They needed a medium tank carrying a 75mm gun. This specific requirement wasn't just about the size of the shell, it was about tactical versatility. A 75mm weapon was a dual-purpose killer. It could fire armor-piercing rounds to punch through the steel hide of enemy tanks, which was obvious. But crucially, it could also fire a heavy, high-explosive shell. This was the game-changer. High-explosive rounds could obliterate concrete fortifications, destroy machine gun nests, and shatter infantry formations. Smaller guns simply couldn't do both effectively. The British 2-pounder, the standard weapon of the Royal Armoured Corps, was a 40mm weapon. It lacked an effective high-explosive round entirely. When British tanks encountered German anti-tank guns or dug-in infantry, they were impotent, forced to rely on their machine guns while being picked apart. The 75mm offered a solution to every problem on the battlefield. One tank could kill enemy armor and slaughter enemy infantry. That flexibility would prove to be the difference between victory and defeat. But there was a catastrophic industrial problem. American factories in 1940 could not build a proper 75mm tank, not yet. The engineering challenge lay in the turret ring. A tank gun sits inside a rotating turret, which rests on a ring of ball bearings mounted to the hull. When a heavy gun fires, the recoil forces slam backward, transferring massive kinetic energy through the turret ring and into the chassis. Bigger guns generate bigger recoil. Bigger recoil requires a much larger, stronger turret ring to prevent the mechanism from jamming or shearing off. A 75mm gun required a turret ring over 60 inches in diameter to handle the violent forces involved. American foundries in 1940 simply could not cast rings that large with the necessary precision. The machining tools didn't exist, the expertise didn't exist. Building new foundries, creating the tooling, and training the workforce would take a minimum of 18 months. The M4 Sherman, the tank the Army actually wanted with a proper turret and a proper gun, was already on the drawing board, but the Sherman wouldn't reach the battlefield in significant numbers until late 1942. The Army needed armor in 1941. They needed something that could fight Panzers now, not in 2 years when the war might already be lost. Desperation breeds invention. Engineers at the Rock Island Arsenal proposed a solution that made everyone uncomfortable. What if, they argued, they didn't put the big gun in a turret at all? What if they mounted the 75mm gun directly into the hull, on the side of the tank? It was an obsolete, archaic concept. World War I tanks had used sponson-mounted guns. Naval vessels still used them, but modern tank doctrine demanded rotating turrets for a reason: flexibility. A sponson gun fixed in the hull could only fire in a limited arc, perhaps 15 degrees to the left or right. To engage a target on the flank, the driver had to rotate the entire 30-ton vehicle. In a fast-moving, swirling tank battle, that delay could be fatal. If the enemy got behind you, you were defenseless. The engineers knew all of this. They understood the tactical liability they were creating. They proposed the design anyway, driven by a single, brutal logic. A 75mm gun in a sponson was infinitely better than no 75mm gun at all. The Army approved development in July 1940. The speed of the program was blistering. The first prototype was ready by January 1941. Production began in August. The result was the M3 medium tank, a machine that stood 10 feet tall. For comparison, the future Sherman would stand 9 feet. A modern M1 Abrams stands just under 8. The M3 towered over everything on the battlefield, a giant steel target screaming for attention. The absurd height came from stacking components like layers of a cake. An aircraft engine sat in the rear, the Wright Continental R975, a radial engine originally designed for airplanes. It was powerful and reliable, but it was tall, forcing the drive shaft to run high through the hull. The 75mm sponson sat in the front right hull. Above it, engineers placed a fully rotating turret carrying a smaller 37mm gun for engaging lighter targets. And on top of that, a commander's cupola with a machine gun, 3 levels of weaponry, reaching 10 feet into the sky. The Three-Storey Disaster. 7 crewmen were squeezed inside this labyrinth. The armor protecting them was riveted steel, 51mm thick at the front. In modern engineering, this construction method was a death trap. To the crew inside, those thousands of rivets were essentially bullets waiting to happen. The physics of impact were terrifying. A non-penetrating hit from a German shell on the outside could transmit enough shockwave to shear a rivet head off on the inside. This steel bolt would then turn into shrapnel, ricocheting around the crowded steel box, maiming men even if the hull wasn't breached. Combined with the suicidal height, these flaws meant American tankers didn't just mock the M3, they feared it. Nobody wanted to go to war in a target that couldn't hide. But between August 1941 and December 1942, American industrial might flexed its muscles. Factories would build 6,258 of these compromised machines, and they were heading to the one place that desperately needed them. In North Africa, the British 8th Army had been losing for 18 months. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had arrived in February 1941 with a small German force to support the collapsing Italian army. Within weeks, he had pushed the British back to the Egyptian border. Within months, he had become the most feared commander in the desert, a tactical genius who seemed always one step ahead. The British launched Operation Crusader in November 1941 to stop him. Over 700 tanks attacked Rommel's positions. The result was a tactical mess. British armor charged headlong into German anti-tank guns. German Panzers, utilizing superior optics and range, picked off British tanks from a distance. The British recaptured ground, but the cost was staggering. They lost over 500 tanks. Rommel lost over 300, more than half of his entire armored force, but he remained a potent threat. The core problem was firepower. British Crusader and Stuart tanks carried 2-pounder guns. These 40mm weapons had one critical flaw. They could only fire armor-piercing rounds. The 2-pounder was effectively a pop gun against modern armor. At combat ranges, it struggled to penetrate the frontal armor of the German Panzer III. The newer Panzer III Specials and Panzer IVs were nearly immune. British tank crews would hit German tanks and watch in horror as their shells simply bounced off. Then, the German 50mm guns would punch through British armor like it was paper. The engagement math was brutal and demoralizing. Germans could kill British tanks at 800 meters or more. The British could barely hurt the Germans at 400 meters. Worse, without effective high-explosive rounds, the British were helpless against soft targets. German 88mm anti-tank crews learned they could stand their ground in the open, knowing the British tanks couldn't blast them with high explosives. For the British crews, it was a recurring nightmare. They had to close to suicidal ranges just to scratch the paint on a Panzer, all while knowing the Germans could punch through their armor before the British could even aim. It wasn't just a tactical problem, it was a crisis of confidence. They knew their tools were broken. By early 1942, the British needed a miracle. What they got was the M3. In January 1942, the first M3 Grants arrived in Egypt. The British had modified the design slightly, installing a different turret with a radio inside to better suit their command structure. They named it after Ulysses S. Grant. The standard American version kept the taller turret and was called the Lee. British tank crews gathered around the towering machines and stared in disbelief. The height was absurd. On the flat, coverless desert, this thing would be visible from miles away. It was a barn door, but then they examined the gun. 75mm. It was almost twice the caliber of their 2-pounders. It could fire armor-piercing rounds to kill tanks and high-explosive rounds to kill everything else. They had been dying with pop guns for 18 months. Then came the moment of truth. They test-fired the 75mm. The report of the gun was thunderous, deeper and more resonant than the crack of the 2-pounder. The 75mm round flew further and hit harder than anything British tankers had ever used. At 1,000 meters, the shell punched cleanly through armor plate, representing a Panzer III. At 1,500 meters, it still made lethal hits. The high-explosive rounds were even more impressive, throwing up fountains of sand and shrapnel. They could destroy gun positions, fortifications, and infantry concentrations from ranges where enemy weapons couldn't even reach the tank. After 18 months of impotence, they suddenly possessed a weapon that could kill anything on the battlefield. The Grant was ugly, the Grant was tall, the Grant was tactically awkward, but the Grant could kill Panzers from a kilometer away. British commanders assigned 167 Grants to the 4th Armored Brigade. They positioned them for Rommel's expected offensive. And then, they waited in the heat. By May 1942, both armies had dug in along the Gazala line in Libya. Rommel commanded 560 tanks. The British had 850, including the 167 new Grants. German intelligence had reported the arrival of tall, awkward American vehicles with hull-mounted guns, but Rommel's staff dismissed the threat. They analyzed the silhouette and concluded the height made them easy prey. The Sponson gun was a World War I concept, easily outflanked. German crews expected another turkey shoot. On the 26th of May, 1942, Rommel launched Operation Venezia. The Afrika Korps swept south around the Gazala line, executing a classic flanking maneuver exactly as planned. German tank commanders, riding high in their turrets, expected another victory, another British retreat, another demonstration of German superiority. The next morning, they ran into the 4th Armored Brigade. The 27th of May, 1942, the desert south of Gazala. Panzers from the 15th Panzer Division spotted British armor on the horizon and moved to engage. They adopted standard tactics, closed the distance to 500 meters, where German guns could penetrate British armor reliably. They felt safe. The distance was 1,200 meters when the British opened fire. German commanders didn't understand what was happening. Shells were impacting around them, slamming into hulls and turrets from ranges where British guns had always been useless. And these shells weren't bouncing off. The 1st Panzer exploded violently, its ammunition cooking off instantly. Fire and smoke erupted from the turret. Then a 2nd Panzer died, then a 3rd. German crews pushed forward, engines screaming, trying to close the gap. Their 50mm guns couldn't penetrate the strange new tanks at this extreme range. They needed to get closer. But the British kept firing. The math of the battlefield had been inverted. The M3 Grant's 75mm gun could penetrate Panzer III frontal armor from 1,000 meters. The short-barreled 50mm guns on most German tanks couldn't penetrate the Grant's thicker frontal armor until point-blank range. That meant the Grants had established a killing zone measured in hundreds of meters. It was a stretch of open desert where they could destroy Panzers that simply couldn't shoot back. German commanders tried to rush through the killing zone. They accelerated toward the British line, hoping speed and dust would save them. It didn't. British gunners, enjoying a stable platform and a superior weapon, had time for multiple shots before German tanks closed to effective range. Each shot that hit meant another Panzer burning. The discipline of the Afrika Korps, usually ironclad, began to crack. Radio nets, typically precise and professional, dissolved into confusion and panic. Veteran crews who had laughed at the Splendid Target were now screaming about invisible batteries destroying them from the horizon. They couldn't understand what was killing them. Reports flooded back to German headquarters throughout the morning, carrying a tone of disbelief. British tanks were engaging from over 1,000 meters. German shells were shattering harmlessly against American steel at range. Multiple Panzers were being lost in each engagement. The attack on the British center had stalled completely. Units that should have broken through were pinned down, taking catastrophic losses. Rommel received the reports in his command vehicle and immediately understood the strategic shift. The Americans had given the British a tank with a gun that outranged everything in his army. 18 months of equipment superiority had vanished overnight. The Afrika Korps wasn't facing the same enemy anymore. Rommel later wrote about Gazala with a rare candor. The advent of the new American tank, he admitted, tore great holes in our ranks. He added a painful truth that signaled the end of an era. Until May 1942, German tanks had in general been superior in quality to the corresponding British types. This was now no longer true. At least, not to the same extent. That phrase, at least not to the same extent, captured the shock of the German high command. For nearly 2 years, German armor had dominated through superior equipment, superior training, and superior tactics. In a single day, American industrial production had erased the equipment advantage. The 75mm gun changed everything. The ugly, mocked, compromised M3 Grant had given British crews the ability to kill Panzers from ranges where they couldn't be killed back. Rommel understood this was just the beginning. If the Americans could build this, what was coming next? But Rommel was a master tactician. and he adapted quickly. He had no choice. The 88mm anti-aircraft gun became his solution. Originally designed to shoot down high-altitude bombers, the 88 could also kill tanks at extreme ranges with terrifying accuracy. It could destroy Grants from 2,000 meters, far beyond the 75mm effective reach. Rommel pushed his 88mm guns forward, embedding them with his armored spearheads. Whenever his Panzers encountered Grants, the 88 seconds would engage first from long range, cracking the Grants open before the tank battle even began. He also desperately requested more Panzer IV Specials, armed with a new high-velocity 75mm gun. The upgraded weapon could match the Grant's range, leveling the playing field. But the new tanks wouldn't arrive in significant numbers for months. The Grant's height remained a fatal flaw throughout the campaign. On the flat desert, German observers could spot the towering profiles from miles away. Every engagement began with the Germans knowing exactly where the British armor was positioned, stripping away the element of surprise. Rommel eventually won the Battle of Gazala through tactical genius, not equipment superiority. He outmaneuvered the British, exploited their command confusion, and drove them back. Tobruk fell in June, a humiliating defeat for the Allies. The British retreated deep into Egypt, digging in at El Alamein, but the cost of Rommel's victory was far higher than he could afford. Rommel captured Tobruk and was promoted to Field Marshal, reaching the zenith of his career, but his tank losses were unsustainable. German factories were producing roughly 300 tanks per month for the entire war effort. American factories were already building over 2,000. Every Panzer destroyed in the desert was effectively irreplaceable. Every Grant destroyed would be replaced within weeks by a Liberty ship docking in Alexandria. Rommel had won the battle, but he was losing the war of production. At the First Battle of El Alamein in July, the British finally stopped him. The Grants weren't enough to win offensive battles against Dug in 88 seconds, but they were formidable enough to hold defensive positions where German armor had to come to them. The Afrika Korps bled against the Grant line. Each attack cost tanks Rommel couldn't replace. The ugly American compromise was doing exactly what it was designed to do, holding the line until better weapons arrived. In October 1942, the first M4 Shermans arrived in Egypt. They were everything the M3 should have been: a proper turret, a rotating 75mm gun, and a lower profile. General Montgomery assembled an overwhelming force for the Second Battle of El Alamein. Over 1,000 tanks, Grants, Shermans, Crusaders faced Rommel's depleted forces. Over 1,000 artillery pieces rained fire on the German lines. The attack began on October 23rd. 12 days later, Rommel was in full retreat. The Afrika Korps would never recover. The Grant's 6-month war was over. It had held the line from the desperate days of Gazala to the victory at El Alamein. It had bled the Afrika Korps of irreplaceable tanks
Coffin,
and veteran crews. The Coffin for 7 brothers. The Iron Cathedral. The Splendid Target. It had done its job. Today, surviving M3s sit in museums around the world. Visitors often walk past them, their eyes drawn to the sleeker Shermans or the menacing Tigers. They glance at the awkward, 10-foot silhouette, the rivets, and the strange gun placement, and they wonder why anyone would build something so ugly. The answer is simple, yet profound. Because ugly was available when perfect wasn't. American engineers knew every flaw in the design before the first M3 ever left the factory floor. They knew about the height, the tactical limits of the sponson gun, and the danger of the riveted armor. They built it anyway because the alternative was nothing. The M3 wasn't designed to be the best tank in the world. It was designed to exist when the best tank wasn't possible yet. Rommel understood the terrifying implication of that machine better than anyone. The Americans, he noted with dread, had designed, built, and deployed an effective medium tank in under a year. Germany, with all its engineering prowess, had nothing comparable to that raw industrial capability. The M3 Grant was a flawed, ugly stopgap, but it was the stopgap that saved North Africa.